Chapter 2 of Spinning Wheel Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lauren Jane. Spinning Wheel Stories by Louisa May Alcott. Tabby's Tablecloth. The storm kept on all night, and next morning the drifts were higher, the wind stronger, and the snow falling faster than ever. Through the day the children roved about the great house, amusing themselves as best they could, and when evening came they gathered around the fire again, eager for the promised story from Grandmamma. "I've a little cold," said the old lady, "and I'm too hoarse for talking, my dears. But Aunt Elinor has looked up a parcel of old tales that I've told her at different times and which she has written down. You will like to hear her reading better than my dull way of telling them, and I can help Minnie and Lotty with their work, for I see they are bent on learning to spin." The young folk were well pleased with Grandma's proposal, for Aunt Nell was a favorite with all, being lively and kind and fond of children, and the only maiden aunt in the family. Now she smilingly produced a faded old portfolio, and turning over a little pile of manuscripts, said in her pleasant way, "Here are all sorts, picked up in my travels at home and abroad, and in order to suit all of you, I have put the names on slips of paper into this basket, and each can draw one in turn. Does that please my distinguished audience?" "Yes, yes. Jeff's the oldest, let him draw first," cried the flock, fluttering like a flight of birds before they settle. "Girls come first," answered the boy, with a nod toward the eldest girl cousin. Lotty put in her hand, and after some fumbling, drew out a paper on which was written Tabby's Tablecloth. "Is that a good one?" she asked, for Jeff looked disappointed. "More fighting, though a girl is still the heroine," answered Aunt Nell, searching for the manuscript. "I think 2 revolutions will be enough for you, General," added Grandmamma, laughing. "Do we beat in both?" asked the boy, brightening up at once. "Yes." "All right, then. I vote for Dolly's dishcloth, or whatever it is, though I don't see what it can possibly have to do with war," he added. "Ah, my dear, women have their part to play as well as men at such times, and do it bravely, though one does not hear so much about their courage. I've often wished someone would collect all that can be found about these neglected heroines, and put it in a book for us to read, admire, and emulate when our turn comes." Grandma looked thoughtfully at the fire as she spoke, and Lotty said, with her eye on the portfolio, "Perhaps Aunt Nell will do it for us. Then history won't be so dry, and we can glorify our foremothers as well as fathers. I'll see what I can find. Now spin away, Minnie, and sit still, boys, if you can." Then, having settled Grandma's footstool and turned up the lamp, Aunt Nell read the tale of Tabby's Tablecloth. On the 20th day of March, 1775, a little girl was trudging along a country road with a basket of eggs on her arm. She seemed in a great hurry and looked anxiously about her as she went, for those were stirring times, and Tabitha Tarbell lived in a town that took a famous part in the Revolution. She was a rosy-faced, bright-eyed lass of 14, full of vigor, courage, and patriotism, and just then much excited by the frequent rumors which reached Concord that the British were coming to destroy the stores sent there for safekeeping while the enemy occupied Boston. Tabby glowed with wrath at the idea, and, metaphorically speaking, shook her fist at august King George, being a staunch little rebel, ready to fight and die for her country rather than submit to tyranny of any kind. In nearly every house something valuable was hidden. Colonel Barrett had 6 barrels of powder, Ebenezer Hubbard 68 barrels of flour. Axes, tents, and spades were at Daniel Cray's, and Captain David Brown had guns, cartridges, and musket balls. Cannon were hidden in the woods, firearms were being manufactured at Barrett's mills, cartouche boxes, belts, and holsters at Reuben Brown's, saltpetre at Josiah Melvin's, and much oatmeal was prepared at Captain Timothy Wheeler's. A morning gun was fired, a guard of 10 men patrolled the town at night, and the brave farmers were making ready for what they felt must come. There were Tories in the town who gave the enemy all the information they could gather. Therefore much caution was necessary in making plans lest these enemies should betray them. Passwords were adopted, secret signals used, and messages sent from house to house in all sorts of queer ways. Such a message lay hidden under the eggs in Tabby's basket, and the brave little girl was going on an important errand from her uncle, Captain David Brown, to Deacon Cyrus Hosmer, who lived at the other end of the town by the South Bridge. She had been employed several times before in the same way, and had proved herself quick-witted, stout-hearted, and light-footed. Now, as she trotted along in her scarlet cloak and hood, she was wishing she could still further distinguish herself by some great act of heroism, for good Parson Emerson had patted her on the head and said, "Well done, child," when he heard how she ran all the way to Captain Barrett's in the night to warn him that Dr. Lee, the Tory, had been detected sending information of certain secret plans to the enemy. "I would do more than that, though it was a fearsome run through the dark woods. Wouldn't those two like to know all I know about the stores? But I wouldn't tell 'em, not if they drove a bayonet through me. I'm not afeard of 'em." And Tabby tossed her head defiantly as she paused to shift her basket from one arm to the other. But she evidently was afeard of something, for her ruddy cheeks turned pale and her heart gave a thump as two men came in sight, and stopped suddenly on seeing her. They were strangers, and though nothing in their dress indicated it, the girl's quick eye saw that they were soldiers. Step and carriage betrayed it, and the rapidity with which these martial gentlemen changed into quiet travelers roused her suspicions at once. They exchanged a few whispered words, then they came on, swinging their stout sticks, one whistling, the other keeping a keen lookout along the lonely road before and behind them. "My pretty lass, can you tell me where Mr. Daniel Bliss lives?" asked the younger, with a smile and a salute. Tabby was sure now that they were British, for the voice was deep and full, the face a ruddy English face, and the man they wanted was a well-known Tory. But she showed no sign of alarm, beyond the modest color in her cheeks, and answered civilly, "Yes, sir, over yonder a piece." "Thanks, and a kiss for that," said the young man, stooping to bestow his gift. But he got a smart box on the ear, and Tabby ran off in a fury of indignation. With a laugh they went on, never dreaming that the little rebel was going to turn spy herself and get the better of them. She hurried away to Deacon Hosmer's and did her errand, adding thereto the news that strangers were in town. "We must know more of them," said the deacon. "Clap a different suit on her, wife, and send her with the eggs to Mrs. Bliss. We have all we want of them, and Tabby can look well about her while she rests and gossips over there. Bliss must be looked after smartly, for he is a knave and will do us harm." Away went Tabby in a blue cloak and hood, much pleased with her mission, and coming to the Tory's house about noon, smelt afar off a savory odor of roasting meat and baking pies. Stepping softly to the back door, she peeped through a small window, and saw Mrs. Bliss and her handmaid cooking away in the big kitchen, too busy to heed the little spy, who slipped round to the front of the house to take a general survey before she went in. All she saw confirmed her suspicions, for in the keeping-room a table was set forth in great style, with the silver tankards, best china, and the fine damask tablecloth, which the housewife kept for holidays. Still another peep through the lilac bushes before the parlor windows showed her the two strangers, closeted with Mr. Bliss, all talking earnestly, but in too low a tone for a word to reach even her sharp ears. "I will know what they are at. I'm sure it is mischief, and I won't go back with only my walk for my pains," thought Tabby, and marching into the kitchen, she presented her eggs with a civil message from Madam Hosmer. "They are mighty welcome, child. I've used a sight for my custards, and need more for the flip." "We've company to dinner unexpected, and I'm much put about," said Mrs. Bliss, who seemed to be concerned about something besides the dinner, and in her flurry forgot to be surprised at the unusual gift, for the neighbors shunned them, and the poor woman had many anxieties on her husband's account, the family being divided, one brother a Tory and one a rebel. "Can I help, ma'am?" "I'm a master hand at beating eggs, Aunt Hitty says." "I'm tired, and wouldn't mind sitting a bit if I'm not in the way," said Tabby, bound to discover something more before she left. "But you be in the way. We don't want any help, so you'd better be stepping along home, else something beside eggs may get whipped. Tale-bearers ain't welcome here," said old Pua the maid, a sour spinster who sympathized with her master, and openly declared she hoped the British would put down the Yankee rebels soon and sharply. Mrs. Bliss was in the pantry, and heard nothing of this little passage of arms, for Tabby hotly resented the epithet of tale-bearer, though she knew that the men in the parlor were not the only spies on the premises. "When you are all drummed out of town and this house burned to the ground, you may be glad of my help, and I wish you may get it." "Good day, old crab-apple," answered saucy Tabby, and catching up her basket, she marched out of the kitchen with her nose in the air. But as she passed the front of the house, she could not resist another look at the fine dinner table, for in those days few had time or heart for feasting, and the best napery in china seldom appeared. One window stood open, and as the girl leaned in, something moved under the long cloth that swept the floor. It was not the wind, for the March day was still and sunny, and in a minute out popped a gray cat's head, and Puss came purring to meet the newcomer, whose step had roused her from a nap. Where one tabby hides, another can. Can I dare to do it? What would become of me if found out? How wonderful it would be if I could hear what these men are plotting! I will! A sound in the next room decided her, and thrusting the basket among the bushes, she leapt lightly in and vanished under the table, leaving Puss calmly washing her face on the window sill. As soon as it was done, Tabby's heart began to flutter, but it was too late to retreat, for at that moment in bustled Mrs. Bliss, and the poor girl could only make herself as small as possible, quite hidden under the long folds that fell on all sides from the wide, old-fashioned table. She discovered nothing from the women's chat, for it ran on sage cheese, eggnog, roast pork, and lamentations over a burnt pie. By the time dinner was served and the guests called in to eat it, Tabby was calm enough to have all her wits about her, and pride gave her courage to be ready for the consequences, whatever they might be. For a time the hungry gentlemen were too busy eating to talk much, but when Mrs. Bliss went out and the flip came in, they were ready for business. The window was shut, whereat Tabby exulted that she was inside. The talkers drew closer together and spoke so low that she could only catch a sentence now and then, which caused her to pull her hair with vexation, and they swore a good deal, to the great horror of the pious little maiden curled up at their feet. But she heard enough to prove that she was right, for these men were Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernicre, of the British Army, come to learn where the supplies were stored and how well the town was defended. She heard Mr. Bliss tell them that some of the rebels, as he called his neighbors, had sent him word that he should not leave the town alive, and he was in much fear for his life and property. She heard the Englishmen tell him that if he came with them they would protect him, for they were armed, and 3 of them together could surely get safely off, as no one knew the strangers had arrived but the slip of a girl who showed them the way. Here the slip of a girl nodded her head savagely, and hoped the speaker's ears still tingled with the buffet she gave it. Mr. Bliss gladly consented to this plan, and told them he would show them the road to Lexington, which was a shorter way to Boston than through Weston and Sudbury, the road they came. "These people won't fight, will they?" asked Ensign de Bernicre. "There goes a man who will fight you to the death," answered Mr. Bliss, pointing to his brother Tom, busy in a distant field. The ensign swore again, and gave a stamp that brought his heavy heel down on poor Tabby's hand as she leaned forward to catch every word. The cruel blow nearly forced a cry from her, but she bit her lips and never stirred, though faint with pain. When she could listen again, Mr. Bliss was telling all he knew about the hiding places of the powder, grain, and cannon the enemy wished to capture and destroy. He could not tell much, for the secrets had been well kept, but if he had known that our young rebel was taking notes of his words under his own table, he might have been less ready to betray his neighbors. No one suspected a listener, however, and all Tabby could do was to scowl at 3 pairs of muddy boots, and wish she were a man that she might fight the wearers of them. She very nearly had a chance to fight or fly, for just as they were preparing to leave the table, a sudden sneeze nearly undid her. She thought she was lost, and hid her face, expecting to be dragged out, to instant death perhaps, by the wrathful men of war. "What's that?" exclaimed the ensign, as a sudden pause followed that fatal sound. "It came from under the table," added Captain Brown, and a hand lifted a corner of the cloth. A shiver went through Tabby, and she held her breath, with her eye upon that big brown hand. But the next moment she could have laughed with joy, for pussy saved her. The cat had come to doze on her warm skirts, and when the cloth was raised, fancying she was to be fed by her master, puss rose and walked out purring loudly, tail erect, with its white tip waving like a flag of truce. "'Tis but the old cat, gentlemen, a good beast, and fortunately for us, unable to report our conference," said Mr. Bliss with an air of relief, for he had started guiltily at the bare idea of an eavesdropper. "She sneezed as if she were as great a snuff-taker as an old woman of whom we asked our way above here," laughed the ensign, as they all rose. "And there she is now, coming along as if our grenadiers were after her," exclaimed the captain, as the sound of steps and a wailing voice came nearer and nearer. Tabby took a long breath and vowed that she would beg or buy the dear old cat that had saved her from destruction. Then she forgot her own danger in listening to the poor woman, who came in crying that her neighbors said she must leave town at once, or they would tar and feather her for showing spies the road to a Tory's house. Well for me that I came in and heard their plots, or I might be sent off in like case, thought the girl, feeling that the more perils she encountered, the greater heroine she would be. Mr. Bliss comforted the old soul, bidding her stay there till the neighbors forgot her, and the officers gave her some money to pay for the costly service she had done them. Then they left the room, and after some delay the three men set off, but Tabby was compelled to stay in her hiding place till the table was cleared, and the women deep in gossip as they washed dishes in the kitchen. Then the little spy crept out softly, and raising the window with great care, ran away as fast as her stiff limbs would carry her. By the time she reached the deacon's, however, and told her tale, the Tories were well on their way, Mr. Bliss having provided them with horses that his own flight might be the speedier. So they escaped, but the warning was given, and Tabby received great praise for her hour under the table. The townspeople hastened their preparations, and had time to remove the most valuable stores to neighboring towns, to mount their cannon and drill their minutemen, for these resolute farmers meant to resist oppression, and the world knows how well they did it when the hour came. Such an early spring had not been known for years, and by the 19th of April fruit trees were in bloom, winter grain was up, and the stately elms that fringed the river and overarched the village streets were budding fast. It seemed a pity that such a lovely world should be disturbed by strife, but liberty was dearer than prosperity or peace, and the people leaped from their beds when young Dr. Prescott came riding for his life with the message Paul Revere brought from Boston in the night: "Arm, arm, the British are coming." Like an electric spark the news ran from house to house, and men made ready to fight, while the brave women bade them go, and did their best to guard the treasure confided to their keeping. A little later word came that the British were at Lexington and blood had been shed. Then the farmers shouldered their guns, with few words but stern faces, and by sunrise 100 men stood ready, with good Parson Emerson at their head. More men were coming in from the neighboring towns, and all felt that the hour had arrived when patience ceased to be a virtue, and rebellion was just. Great was the excitement everywhere, but at Captain David Brown's one little heart beat high with hope and fear, as Tabby stood at the door, looking across the river to the town, where drums were beating, bells ringing, and people hurrying to and fro. "I can't fight, but I must see," she said, and catching up her cloak, she ran over the North Bridge, promising her aunt to return and bring her word as soon as the enemy appeared. "What news? Are they coming?" called the people from the manse and the few houses that then stood along that road. But Tabby could only shake her head and run the faster in her eagerness to see what was happening on that memorable day. When she reached the middle of the town, she found that the little company had gone along the Lexington road to meet the enemy. Nothing daunted, she hurried in that direction, and climbing a high bank, waited to catch a glimpse of the British grenadiers, of whom she had heard so much. About 7 o'clock they came, the sun glittering on the arms of 800 English soldiers, marching toward the 100 stout-hearted farmers who waited till they were within a few rods of them. "Let us stand our ground, and if we die, let us die here," said brave Parson Emerson, still among his people, ready for anything but surrender. "Nay," said a cautious Lincoln man, "it will not do for us to begin the war." So they reluctantly fell back to the town, the British following slowly, being weary with their 7-mile march over the hills from Lexington. Coming to a little brown house perched on the hillside, one of the thirsty officers spied a well, with the bucket swinging at the end of the long pole. Running up the bank, he was about to drink, when a girl, who was crouching behind the well, sprang up and with an energetic gesture flung the water in his face, crying, "That's the way we serve spies." Before Ensign de Bernicre, for it was he acting as guide to the enemy, could clear his eyes and dry his drenched face, Tabby was gone over the hill with a laugh and a defiant gesture toward the redcoats below. In high feather at this exploit, she darted about the town, watching the British at their work of destruction. They cut down and burnt the Liberty Pole, broke open 60 barrels of flour, flung 500 pounds of balls into the mill pond and wells, and set the courthouse on fire. Other parties were ordered to different quarters of the town to ransack houses and destroy all the stores they found. Captain Parsons was sent to take possession of the North Bridge, and de Bernicre led the way, for he had taken notes on his former visit and was a good guide. As they marched, a little scarlet figure went flying on before them and vanished at the turn of the road. It was Tabby, hastening home to warn her aunt. "Quick, child, whip on this gown and cap and hurry into bed. These prying fellows will surely have pity on a sick girl and respect this room, if no other," said Mrs. Brown, briskly helping Tabby into a short nightgown and round cap, and tucking her well up when she was laid down, for between the plump feather beds were hidden many muskets, the most precious of their stores. This had been planned beforehand, and Tabby was glad to rest and tell her tale, while Auntie Brown put physic bottles and glasses on the table, set some evil-smelling herbs to simmer on the hearth, and, compromising with her conscience, concocted a nice little story to tell the invaders. Presently they came, and it was well for Tabby that the ensign remained below to guard the doors, while the men ransacked the house from garret to cellar, for he might have recognized the saucy girl who had twice maltreated him. "These are feathers. Lift the covers carefully, or you'll be half smothered, they fly about so," said Mrs. Brown, as the men came to some casks of cartridges and flints, which she had artfully ripped up several pillows to conceal. Quite deceived, the men gladly passed on, leaving the very things they most wanted to destroy. Coming to the bedroom, where more treasures of the same valuable sort were hidden in various nooks and corners, the dame held up her finger, saying, with an anxious glance toward Tabby, "Step softly, please. You wouldn't harm a poor sick girl. The doctor thinks it is smallpox, and a fright might kill her. I keep the chamber as fresh as I can with yarbs, so I guess there isn't much danger of catching it." The men reluctantly looked in, saw a flushed face on the pillow, for Tabby was red with running, and her black eyes wild with excitement, took a sniff at the wormwood and motherwort, and with a hasty glance into a closet or two where sundry clothes concealed hidden doors, hastily retired to report the danger and get away as soon as possible. They would have been much disgusted at the trick played upon them if they had seen the sick girl fly out of bed and dance a jig of joy as they tramped away to Barrett's Mills. But soon Tabby had no heart for merriment, as she watched the Minutemen gather by the bridge, saw the British march down on the other side, and when their first volley killed brave Isaac Davis and Abner Hosmer of Acton, she heard Major Buttrick give the order, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" For a little while shots rang, smoke rose, shouts were heard, and red and blue coats mingled in the struggle on the bridge. Then the British fell back, leaving 2 dead soldiers behind them. These were buried where they fell, and the bodies of the Acton men were sent home to their poor wives, Concord's first martyrs for liberty. No need to tell more of the story of that day. All children know it, and many have made a pilgrimage to see the old monument set up where the English fell, and the bronze Minuteman standing on his granite pedestal to mark the spot where the brave Concord farmers fired the shot that made the old North Bridge immortal. We must follow Tabby and tell how she got her tablecloth. When the fight was over, the dead buried, the wounded cared for, and the prisoners exchanged, the Tories were punished. Dr. Lee was confined to his own farm on penalty of being shot if he left it, and the property of Daniel Bliss was confiscated by government. Some things were sold at auction, and Captain Brown bought the fine cloth and gave it to Tabby, saying heartily, "There, my girl, that belongs to you, and you may well be proud of it, for thanks to your quick wits and eyes and ears we were not taken unawares, but sent the redcoats back faster than they came." And Tabby was proud of it, keeping it carefully, displaying it with immense satisfaction whenever she told the story, and spinning busily to make a set of napkins to go with it. It covered the table when her wedding supper was spread, was used at the christening of her first boy, and for many a Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner through the happy years of her married life. Then it was preserved by her daughters as a relic of their mother's youth, and long after the old woman was gone, the well-worn cloth still appeared on great occasions, till it grew too thin for anything but careful keeping, to illustrate the story so proudly told by the grandchildren, who found it hard to believe that the feeble old lady of 90 could be the lively lass who played her little part in the Revolution with such spirit. In 1861, Tabby's tablecloth saw another war and made an honorable end. When men were called for, Concord responded, "Here," and sent a goodly number, led by another brave Colonel Prescott. Barretts, Hosmers, Melvins, Browns, and Wheelers stood shoulder to shoulder as their grandfathers stood that day to meet the British by the bridge. Mothers said, "Go, my son," as bravely as before, and sisters and sweethearts smiled with wet eyes as the boys in blue marched away again, cheered on by another noble Emerson. More than one of Tabby's descendants went, some to fight, some to nurse, and for 4 long years the old town worked and waited, hoped and prayed, burying the dear dead boys sent home, nursing those who brought back honorable wounds, and sending more to man the breaches made by the awful battles that filled both North and South with a wilderness of graves. The women knit and sewed Sundays as well as weekdays, to supply the call for clothes. The men emptied their pockets freely, glad to give, and the minister, after preaching like a Christian soldier, took off his coat and packed boxes of comforts like a tender father. "More lint and bandages called for, and I do believe we've torn and picked up every old rag in the town," said one busy lady to another, as several sat together making comfort bags in the 3rd year of the long struggle. "I have cleared my garret of nearly everything in it, and only wish I had more to give," answered one of the patriotic Barrett mothers. "We can't buy anything so soft and good as worn-out sheets and tablecloths. New ones won't do, or I'd cut up every one of mine," said a newly married Wheeler, sewing for dear life as she remembered the many cousins gone to the war. "I think I shall have to give a Revolutionary tablecloth. It's old enough and soft as silk, and I'm sure my blessed grandmother would think that it couldn't make a better end," spoke up white-headed Madam Hubbard, for Tabby Tarbell had married one of that numerous and worthy race. "Oh, you wouldn't cut up that famous cloth, would you?" cried the younger woman. "Yes, I will. It's in rags, and when I'm gone no one will care for it. Folks don't seem to remember what the women did in those days, so it's no use keeping relics of 'em," answered the old lady, who would have owned herself mistaken if she could have looked forward to 1876, when the town celebrated its centennial and proudly exhibited the little scissors with which Mrs. Barrett cut paper for cartridges, among other ancient trophies of that earlier day. So the ancient cloth was carefully made into a box full of the finest lint and softest squares to lay on wounds, and sent to one of the Concord women who had gone as a nurse. "Here's a treasure," she said, as she came to it among other comforts newly arrived from home. "Just what I want for my brave rebel and poor little Johnny Bullard." The brave rebel was a Southern man who had fought well and was badly wounded in many ways, yet never complained, and in the midst of great suffering was always so courteous, patient, and courageous that the men called him "our gentleman," and tried to show how much they respected so gallant a foe. John Bullard was an English drummer boy who had been through several battles, stoutly drumming away in spite of bullets and cannon balls, cheering many a campfire with his voice, for he sang like a blackbird, and was always merry, always plucky, and so great a favorite in his regiment that all mourned for little Johnny when his right arm was shot off at Gettysburg. It was thought he would die, but he pulled through the worst of it, and was slowly struggling back to health, still trying to be gay, and beginning to chirp feebly now and then like a convalescent bird. "Here, Johnny, is some splendid lint for this poor arm, and some of the softest compresses for Carol's wound. He is asleep, so I'll begin with you, and while I work I'll amuse you with the story of the old tablecloth this lint came from," said Nurse Hunt, as she stood by the bed where the thin, white face smiled at her, though the boy dreaded the hard quarter of an hour he had to endure every day. "Thank you, Mum. We haven't had a story for a good bit. I'm hearty this morning, and think I'll be up by this day week, won't I?" "I hope so. Now shut your eyes and listen, then you won't mind the twinges I give you, gentle as I try to be," answered the nurse, beginning her painful task. Then she told the story of Tabby's tablecloth, and the boy enjoyed it immensely, laughing out at the slapping and the throwing water in the ensign's face, and openly rejoicing when the redcoats got the worst of it. "As we've beaten all the rest of the world, I don't mind our having bad luck that time. We're friends now, and I'll fight for you, Mum, like a British bulldog, if I ever get the chance," said Johnny, when the tale and dressing were ended. "So you shall. I like to turn a brave enemy into a faithful friend, as I hope we shall yet be able to do with our Southern brothers. I admire their courage and their loyalty to what they believe to be right, and we are all suffering the punishment we deserve for waiting till this sad war came, instead of settling the trouble years ago, as we might have done if we had loved honesty and honor more than money and power." As she spoke, Miss Hunt turned to her other patient, and saw by the expression of his face that he had heard both the tale and the talk. He smiled and said, "Good morning," as usual, but when she stooped to lay a compress of the soft, wet damask on the angry wound in his breast, he whispered with a grateful look, "You have changed one Southern brother from an enemy into a friend. Whether I live or die, I never can forget how generous and kind you have all been to me. Thank you. It is worth months of anxiety and care to hear such words. Let us shake hands, and do our best to make North and South as good friends as England and America now are," said the nurse, offering her hand. "Me too. I've got one hand left, and I give it to you with all me heart. God bless you, sir, and a lively getting up for the two of us," cried Johnny, stretching across the narrow space that divided the beds with a beaming face and true English readiness to forgive a fallen foe when he had proved a brave one. The three hands met in a warm shake, and the act was a little lesson more eloquent than words to the lookers on, for the spirit of brotherhood that should bind us all together worked the miracle of linking these three by the frail threads spun a century ago. So Tabby's tablecloth did make a beautiful and useful end at last. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Lauren Jane, Dublin, Ireland.